Hello, and welcome to the channel where we don't chase rumors for the sake of sensation, but instead discuss the real processes behind loud versions of events. Lately, the question has been asked more and more often, who rules Russia? Putin or his double? But if it really is a double, then the main question is not who is on screen, but why this mask is needed by the system. The idea of doubles of rulers is not new. It has always appeared in regimes where power was tied to one person. The stronger the state's dependence on a single leader, the greater the temptation to create the illusion that this leader is omnipresent, invincible, and eternal. Let's recall the Third Reich. Adolf Hitler did have doubles. They were carefully trained by the secret services, taught to copy his walk, speech, and mannerisms. The point was simple: to confuse conspirators, to hide the Führer's real location, to minimize the risk of assassination. But none of these measures saved him. Berlin fell, and the doubles became just a historical detail. A similar practice existed in Iraq. Saddam Hussein used several doubles at once. They were brought out in public during times of threat to create the illusion of his omnipresence. Saddam himself encouraged this myth. People never knew for sure whether the president in front of them was real. But when the U.S. launched its military operation in 2003, no doubles were able to keep the regime from falling. In the Soviet Union, there are also legends. It was said that Stalin had doubles, especially in his later years when he feared assassination. About Brezhnev, they said that during parades he was sometimes replaced when his health no longer allowed him to appear. There is no solid evidence, but the very fact that these rumors spread speaks volumes. The system wanted to appear strong even when the leader was weak and ill. So let's ask ourselves, why are these doubles needed at all? History gives a clear answer. First, for security, to reduce the risk of assassination. Second, for psychology, to create the image of an immortal, omnipresent leader. Third, for manipulation, to hide illness and weakness. And finally, for politics, to prevent society from sensing a vacuum of power. And here arises the main question: what is happening in Russia today? Why does the theme of Putin's doubles surface again and again? Such conversations first appeared back in the 2000s. Some said that Putin appeared less in public. Others noticed changes in his voice, gait, or facial expressions. Over the years, these versions only grew stronger, especially when the president disappeared from the public eye for weeks or when his appearance visibly changed. There were even specific versions of Putin named the combat-ready, the sickly, the young, and the aged. The internet was full of photo comparisons, where sometimes the ears seemed different, sometimes the chin, sometimes the height. The Kremlin always reacted with irony, but the fact remains: the myth of Putin's doubles has long since become part of political folklore. But if we put aside rumors and emotions, something else is important. In today's Russia, such conversations do not exist by themselves. They serve very specific functions. First, they distract attention. While people argue about whether the Putin on screen is real, they think less about who actually makes decisions in the Kremlin. Second, they strengthen the aura of mystery. Putin becomes a figure shrouded in enigma, and an enigma is always stronger than a simple image. And finally, these versions blur responsibility. If it's the real Putin, he is accountable for everything. But if it's a double, then it's almost a game where reality and imitation are impossible to tell apart. And here we arrive at the key point. It doesn't matter whether it's the real Putin or his copy. What matters is who is making decisions in Russia today. On the one hand, the very logic of a personalist regime suggests that the decisive role remains with Putin. He concentrates power, he signs key documents, and It is his word that is final when it comes to war or diplomacy. In this model, doubles are just a facade, a tool to cover gaps in his health and maintain the illusion of omnipresence. Decisions are still made personally, and therefore the responsibility lies with him. But what if Putin is no longer fully capable of governing or not present at all? Then the real question is different. Who controls these substitutes? And why does the system continue to use them? Why not announce a transition, hold new elections, start a leadership change? The answer is simple. In authoritarian models, elections are not a means of transferring power. They exist only to confirm what is already there. Any transition means new deals, new risks, and the threat of fracture. And the image of Putin, even a conditional one, gives the elite what matters most: familiar stability. With him, everything is clear. Without him begins uncertainty. That is why doubles are needed not by the people, but by the elites themselves. It is their way of holding on to the status quo and delaying the moment of choice. At the same time, we must not forget that around Putin there has long existed a whole system of power groups. These are the Siloviki, who increasingly dictate the logic of internal control and war. These are the bureaucrats, for whom the top priority is to preserve stability and prevent chaos. These are the big corporations and financial structures which, even without direct political power, still shape economic conditions and push the regime towards certain decisions. In this logic, Putin is no longer the only player. He is the arbiter, endorsing the balance among the Kremlin's competing factions. And today we have a mixed picture. Putin remains the chief arbiter, but the space around him is increasingly filled by groups preparing options, pressing the system, and shaping the field of possibilities. The leader in such conditions no longer decides everything himself, but only the most critical questions. That is why the legend of doubles is convenient. It shifts attention from substance to appearance, forcing people to argue about looks instead of the real question: who shapes Russia's course? And here arises a much more important question than talk of doubles. What happens if Putin weakens or disappears from this system altogether? In personalist regimes, there's always the temptation to think that everything depends on one man. But in reality, the mechanism works differently. The first thing such a system does when the leader weakens is try to preserve the picture. Substitutes appear, myths spread. The same faces show up on screen, even if the real center of power retreats into the shadows. This is not for Western audiences, but for domestic elites. There must be no sense of a vacuum of power. But such a situation cannot last indefinitely. The moment comes when real decisions must be made. And then those same groups of influence we talked about begin to emerge. The Siloviki will demand a hard line and continuation of the course. The bureaucrats will push to keep the system from collapsing. The corporations and economic elites will focus on minimizing risks for business. And at this point, Putin's absence can no longer be concealed. If he remains arbiter, even in a limited way, the system continues to function. If he disappears entirely, bargaining and struggle begin. History shows that such regimes almost never shift into stable collective governance. They need a new arbiter, a new figure to take on the role of the final word. And this is the real role of doubles. They can maintain the picture, they can buy some time, but they cannot replace political will. At best, they are a tool for delay, to win days or weeks so that the elites can reach a deal about the next step. For the outside world, the question of whether it is the real Putin on screen or a double sounds almost like a curiosity. In the West and in neighboring states, it has long been understood. In terms of international politics, it doesn't matter who steps up to the podium. What matters is where Russia's course is headed, who controls the levers of power, and how stable all this is in a crisis. If decisions are still made by Putin himself, then for the world it is business as usual. There is a leader personally accountable for policy and dealings, negotiations, sanctions, deterrence are conducted with him. If, however, the collective Putin grows in importance, a system where different groups negotiate among themselves while hiding behind his image, then the picture changes. For outsiders, such a regime becomes less predictable. Today, the Siloviki push for escalation. Tomorrow, the bureaucracy leans toward compromise. The next day, economic interests drive power toward deal. Outwardly, it may look like the same course, but cracks appear that are hard to calculate. That is why discussions about doubles are seen in the world not as a question of appearance, but as a signal that the system in Russia may be weaker than it looks. If the leader is hidden or replaced, it means uncertainty around him is growing. And uncertainty in a nuclear power is always alarming. In the end, for the international context, it doesn't matter who stands before the cameras. What matters is clarity. Who controls the arsenals, who makes decisions of war and peace, and how stable all of this is in a crisis. And that remains the central question today. So history shows rulers' doubles have existed, but they never governed states. Their role was always auxiliary, to mask weakness, buy time, or uphold the leader's image. And today's talk of Putin's doubles fits the same logic. Real decisions are either made by Putin himself, remaining the arbiter and main holder of power, or increasingly channeled through the system of power groups that form the so-called collective Putin. But in both cases, the doubles themselves are only a facade, a mask that works for the image but not for governance. For Russia, this means that the leader's personality remains central, even if his image splits between the real man and his stand-ins. For the elites, it is a way to win time and hold stability in a moment of transition. For the outside world, it is a reminder that real politics in Moscow is determined not by the face on screen, but by the narrow circle controlling access to decisions. And here we reach the main conclusion. The real intrigue today is not whether the Putin before the cameras is authentic. The real intrigue is who will define Russia's course tomorrow. The leader himself, his inner circle, or forces already laying claim to power in his name. For now, doubles remain only a symbol of this uncertainty. A symbol that Russia has entered an era where personality and system are so entangled that it has become impossible to tell one from the other. And here we come to the sharpest question. How realistic is the version that Putin has long since disappeared and Russia is being governed in his name? At first glance, this version seems convenient. It explains his changing appearance, long absences, and odd behaviors. But if examined seriously, it faces a core contradiction. Doubles can maintain the picture, but they cannot for long replace the figure holding real power. A mask can buy days, weeks, maybe months, but not years. Personalist regimes always need an arbiter, someone to deliver the final word. And if Putin had truly long since disappeared, the system would already have entered a phase of open succession struggle. We would see mass arrests, elite splits, leaks of information. None of this is visible. Therefore, the version that Putin has long vanished is highly improbable. But another outcome is far more likely. His role is gradually becoming more symbolic. Decisions are prepared and made by a narrow circle, and his image, real or doubled, is used to legitimize those decisions. That is why the legend of doubles is so enduring. It reflects not so much Putin's condition as the nature of the regime, which rests on the image of a strong leader, even as real power increasingly shifts into the system. Thank you for watching to the end. Legends about doubles may be intriguing, but the real intrigue is not about Putin's appearance. It is about who will determine Russia's course tomorrow. And that is what we will continue to follow on this channel.